What is going on, everyone? Anthony back here again, and today we're talking about something really special. Resident Evil Memories. Yes, the original Resident Evil, released in America on March 30th, 1996, 26 years ago. And talking about the original Resident Evil and all the memories I have associated with it, I can really go on all day. But when I think about the original Resident Evil, it reminds me of the simplicity of how simple everything was and stripped down everything was in that game, being isolated in a house and only having so many weapons and so many resources. Also, really depending on your choices that you make, you can really put yourself in a bad situation to survive. Resident Evil Director's Cut was released in 1997 with the Resident Evil 2 demo disc, but this wasn't the version that I actually had in my household. In fact, my dad actually bought the original Resident Evil in 1996, which I still have that same copy to this very day. Here it actually is right here. I keep it in this Director's Cut case. I know I probably shouldn't do that. I should probably give it its own case, but in here is the Director's Cut, the first Director's Cut that I remember owning, and this is the original disc, and this is the original first disc. Unfortunately, my dad didn't have the long box by the time I was growing up and actually trying to, collect all these games on my own and just have them in my personal collection as he moved on with other games. But I still have this disc, and it's precious to me to this day, because this is it. It is scratched up. It has a lot of stuff. It still boots up, thankfully. It skips a lot. But this is the original, and I remember actually going back and playing this after I actually played Director's Cut. So Director's Cut was really the first entry into the original Resident Evil, which was this version of Director's Cut with the DualShock controls and the mixed up soundtrack. And that was kind of my introduction, and then I went back, and I was always confused as to what Director's Cut was, and if it, why was it exactly the same? And then obviously when I started to understand more, I realized the different modes, the different costumes, stuff like that. But it was very similar, and it also didn't really have the uncensored stuff like people wanted at the time. And I got the Resident Evil 2 demo disc version later when I got into collecting. But essentially going into Resident Evil and actually trying to be good at these games, Resident Evil 1 was a game that I beat later on, when I got better confidence in the actual game. When I played it early on, even on the Director's Cut copy and the original copy, I really fixated towards the original copy here, because I did like the music better. The music definitely was very off-putting on the DualShock edition, and this is the version that's on the PSN store on PlayStation 3. Now, I gravitated towards the original Resident Evil copy because that edition had normal music and everything else was still there. It just didn't have the extra modes and it didn't have the extra costumes, but I still really enjoyed the original. But for me, because I had to play 2 and 3, and as I got a little bit older and then I went back and got into Resident Evil 1 to beat it and actually feel fulfilled, because the big thing with Resident Evil 1 early on is I would always get lost, not know what to do, or I would always get overwhelmed by zombies in the hallway, specifically the second floor hallway that has the double doors and everything. I just can't, I would always die in that section, and I would always just find a very eerie tone to the first game. Even growing up, I always thought that this had a very distinct tone compared to Resident Evil 2 and 3. Resident Evil 2 and 3 kind of share that same quality to them because it is a sequel. It is more, there is more horror and there is more action elements sprinkled in everywhere. But the thing is that with this one, it always had a distinct tone. And then even with Remake later on, not to get sidetracked, but even that had a very specific tone that it still captured. But with the old school graphics and the old school music, playing this on a PlayStation 1 is incredible still to this day, getting that vibe from a CRT, playing it in that state of mind like you would back in the 90s. It's a really cool thing. if you play it nowadays, you could still enjoy it the same way. But I also just grew up playing it on a 12-inch CRT, playing it on a PlayStation through, one of those cable connectors that you would have to change your channel to 3 or 4 to connect it to in the old TV room of my old house. That's where I remember playing a lot of these games, and I was there all the time playing PS1, and that is where my dad had his console hooked up at the time. So I would obviously play whatever was around, and Resident Evil was one of them. But of course, with Resident Evil 1 is not my first Resident Evil game. I was always watching. Resident Evil 3 was like the very first game that I played, along with 2. It was around 3. I kind of went 3, 2, 1, and then, but it was all in a very short period of time. It's all when I started to really grasp the idea of gaming and how to play, and diving into, stuff like Siphon Filter, and, stuff like Resident Evil and Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and, Metal Gear Solid. The list goes on. If it wasn't for the original game, of course, we wouldn't have had 2 and 3, and I wouldn't have fell in love with video games in general, and this wouldn't have become my favorite franchise, and I wouldn't be here in front of a community right now and doing this for a job. And, it's crazy the ripple effect that this game kind of had in not only the industry, but for a genre and for fans as a whole. This game has changed my life, and it also kind of exposed me to a whole different side of horror that also kind of got me into horror films and horror movies, and going to the video store and renting horror movies and stuff. All that stems from the stuff that you're kind of exposed to on the gaming side of stuff, and these games were around, and PlayStation 1 was around, and PlayStation 1 is my favorite console of all time for multiple reasons, but of course Resident Evil being one of them, and being kind of a part of that, a chunk of that time is really dedicated towards like just trying to master those games, even if you sucked at them, but just trying to play them over and over again because you only had so many games to play. Even the voice acting, which is just great to this day, is very classic to us Resident Evil fans as we joke about it throughout the years. But from that to both scenarios working and being able to actually save each survivor, but the only thing that they always had was, you could never save Barry when you were with Chris, and then you could never save Rebecca when you were with Jill, but they still had you save or choose to have different options and to have multiple endings, which was a really cool thing to have at the time, and also kind of made replay value, because a lot of times if people played that first run, they definitely didn't get every single ending, or maybe they did get the perfect ending, maybe they did save everyone, but it was really cool that they added that right from the start, right from the very first game, and it made you go back and see all the different cutscenes, and the live action intro and the live action cutscenes with all the characters is just classic as well, and that's something I do remember being burned into my mind. Of course, it was all black and white, and it was just like a very like creepy movie vibe, and in a way it was one of the first like horror-ish movie things I was exposed to, because it was almost like a horror short film or like a student film, but it almost worked really well, and it was very creepy and effective. And I remember it really creeped me out when I was a kid, just seeing that intro and not knowing what the hell I was going to get into, because the intro was so real because it was live action, obviously, but then you go into this PS1 graphic, engine, and obviously it looks like it was, but it didn't matter, because back then, that's what I was exposed to. That's what was around. That was still kind of current in the PS1 era, and you just didn't know what the hell you were going to get into. You didn't know what was going to be behind each door. So this game really stood out to me on all levels when it comes to the trilogy, and still does to this day, but it really left an impact because, again, it was just part of that time where I was really learning how to play games and try to get better at them, and then coming back to it a couple years later and beating it, and the strategy guide. Let's not forget the strategy guides. Now, my dad had the strategy guide for the director's cut, the DualShock director's cut, and that was my guide to actually beating the game, because a lot of times with Resident Evil 2 and 3 that he also had the guides for, those helped me tremendously going through the game, and that's what you did back then. There wasn't video guides. So the same thing with going and trying to beat the original. I used the director's cut guide for the original, but it was for advanced mode. It was the one that covered advanced modes or arranged mode, so it was completely different. So I kind of had to just like figure it out and like kind of get through it. But even with Resident Evil 1, it wasn't too extensive. The puzzles weren't too bad. You just had to know like, what to unlock, where to go, and the fluidity. But I always had problems with the hunters, and I always had problems with the boss fights growing up, obviously trying to learn the patterns and stuff like that. And it was very limited because, of course, with Resident Evil 1, you only get so many weapons, you only get so many options with your controls. They don't have the 180 quick turn yet. There wasn't any auto aim in the original Resident Evil 96 version, so you have to just do what you can do with that, and that's kind of what I like about it. And it still creates a really interesting challenge to this day when you fire up that original Resident Evil. Now, eventually, years later, I did grab the director's cut that came with the Resident Evil 2 demo, and I do realize that that kind of justified the purchase back then. I have a vivid memory of when Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock, I think, was out for a little bit, and my dad purchased it, and I remember we were really excited, and we wanted him to pop it in and play it, and my dad was like, what the hell, it's the same game. You know, he didn't realize that it was actually, you know, the same exact thing. He thought it was going to be something actually different, so he kind of like spent his money and was just like, what the hell. And I remember me and my brother made fun of the zombie head turn because we saw that, and my brother was like, oh, he has lipstick on his lips, you know, that's not blood. And he was just like, you know, just like saying that, like, you know, just because we thought it was funny. And yeah, I just remember the zombie head turn. Like, I'll never forget the zombie head turn. That was something that I'll just never forget. And I did see it on the director's cut DualShock version first. That was what I was exposed to, being very young. But I just remember, like, my dad was really confused and you know, he didn't get it. Now, of course, it had different modes, but for him, he just saw it the same game and was like, whatever. He was already on to Resident Evil 2. At that point, he probably already beat Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 was probably already out, and RE3 was probably coming out. He probably just saw director's cut and was like, oh, what's this? And then popped it in and was like, what the hell? It's the same thing. So that's another memory that I have that's kind of connected to it, and that was in my old TV room, which was, you know, I played in my room on a small 12-inch CRT, but a lot of the times growing up, I also played in the TV room, which we had like a 26-inch big box TV that had all these adjustments on it and stuff like that. Now, of course, the original Resident Evil has been released a couple times, not just on the original PlayStation, but on the Sega Saturn, the PC, and in 2006, we got the Resident Evil Deadly Silence version that came with a rebirth mode, multiplayer, and updated controls. Arguably the best version of Resident Evil, the original, in terms of how they technically improved it. With Resident Evil, though, released in 1996, and of course, you know, my dad got that first game and bought the other sequels, so they were just in my library of PS1 ammunition stuff that I was just playing, popping in, checking out, and being exposed to that stuff. You know, I just became a fan. Became a fan of gaming, found my favorite franchise, was able to build a great community here on YouTube 12 years ago, wanted to start out this channel to build a community and create a podcast, which is the first podcast, RE podcast on YouTube, and I'm still proud of that. And to have a community to keep growing is just fantastic, and it's all because of this game. It's all because of the OG Resident Evil, and of course thanks to Capcom for keeping it going all these years and making this franchise, you know, thrive, and also just to see different generations of fans and different people get exposed to it at different times. And, you know, however you have to go and discover the originals. That's why you always have to respect the original trilogy, despite the remakes and despite, you know, some people make fun of them. That's fine. You can meme on them all you want. But people like us, the hardcore fans, we understand that there is a genuine charm to these games, and there's also a, like, actual, like, blueprint. This is like a blueprint within the survival horror game. If it wasn't for Resident Evil 1996, the original, Biohazard, whatever you want to call it, I wouldn't be here. You guys wouldn't be here into this community. It's just crazy. And that ripple effect is nuts. And 26 years later, it's still going. And, you know, we'll just keep it going, and I'll keep making content on all the Resident Evil stuff that I love throughout the years, stuff that I can talk about all day long, always different video ideas I can come up with, because there's so much rich detail in 26 years of releases, anniversaries, collectibles, just everything. And it's something I never get tired of talking about because it's part of my life, and if it wasn't for these games on the original PS1, I probably wouldn't even be into gaming. So I don't even know what would have happened. I probably would have, because obviously it was around. You know, my dad was a gamer, but, you know, just, I guess these kind of games too, you know, being into the horror genre and the different things that I like. So it means a lot on a very personal level. And you know, I really want to hear what you guys have to share about the original Resident Evil 1996 and your memories. And you could talk about director's cut too, because it all is pretty much the same game. So do you have memories with the original, director's cut? You know, do you own these in your collection? Which ones do you own? And let me know your memories down below. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe and hit the bell notification as well if you're new. And I really appreciate the support, and stay tuned for more Let's Talk Resident Evil content. And I also have a podcast coming out on the Let's Talk Resident Evil podcast on YouTube, and of course all digital platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Libsyn, where I go a little bit more in depth with the whole 26-year anniversary as a whole. That's a whole longer podcast, so check that out as well, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye. A big shout out to everyone that supports me on Patreon and YouTube memberships. YouTube members grants you access to voting on content with custom badges and emojis for chats. Patreon gives you the same voting privilege, but even more. Gain access to uncut recording sessions, weekly exclusive Patreon shows, and live hangouts on Patreon. Tiers start at just $1. Thank you so much for your support, and I will catch you next time.